Ayman al Zawahiri, Prophet of War, Architect of Terror. Part 1, Origins of a Radical. Childhood, Family, and Early Influences. Ayman Muhammad Rabi al-Zawahiri, the man who would one day rise to helm the world's most notorious jihadist organization, was born on June 19, 1951, in the leafy suburb of Mahdi in Giza, Egypt. His birth into one of Egypt's most illustrious families granted him early access to privilege, education, and an upbringing steeped in both intellectualism and religiosity. The al-Zawahiri family was not only part of Egypt's professional elite, but was also deeply embedded in its religious, political, and scholarly spheres. These origins would help shape the path of a young boy who would, over time, abandon the stethoscope for the sword of ideology and become a global symbol of militancy. Ayman's father, Dr. Mohammed Rabi al-Zawahiri, was a highly respected figure in Egypt's medical and academic communities. He was a professor of pharmacy at Cairo University, renowned for his intellect, gentle demeanor, and strict adherence to religious values. On his mother's side, Ayman inherited a legacy equally prestigious. His maternal grandfather, Abdul Wahab Azam, had served as the president of Cairo University and was also the founding rector of King Saud University in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. A diplomatic figure, Azam had also held the post of ambassador to Pakistan and was brother to Azam Pasha, the first Secretary General of the Arab League. This convergence of elite education, Islamic tradition, and political influence meant that Ayman grew up in a household saturated with conservative pride and pan-Islamic identity. Beyond these prominent figures, his family was part of a broader intellectual and social aristocracy. The al-Zawahiris traced part of their lineage to the Red Sea Harbi tribe, and the Azam family was connected by marriage to the Saudi royal family through Muna, the daughter of Azam Pasha, who had married a son of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. These ties, though distant, reinforced the aura of historical legitimacy and religious prestige that surrounded the al-Zawahiri name. Such a pedigree, paradoxically, would later contrast sharply with Ayman's future as an international fugitive and extremist. Though raised in a home of wealth and opportunity, Ayman's formative years were also shaped by internal contradiction. In contrast to his family's secular and professional accomplishments, Ayman showed early signs of deep religiosity. Even as a young boy, he was quiet, disciplined, and inwardly intense. His twin sister, Umnya, and younger sister Hiba, who would later become a professor of oncology at Cairo University, described him as shy and contemplative, someone who preferred books to games. Hiba recalled how her brother avoided loud or physical activities, preferring poetry, Islamic texts, and long hours of study. He was not drawn to sports or social mischief like other boys of his age. Instead, he excelled academically and was known among peers for his sharp intellect and sense of purpose. His moral compass, according to those close to him, was tightly aligned with a rigid understanding of Islam. That rigidity found an influential model in his uncle Mahfouz Azam, a lawyer and devout Islamist who profoundly shaped the boy's ideological worldview. Mahfouz introduced Ayman to the writings of Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian thinker whose execution by the Nasser regime in 1966 would make him a martyr and radicalizing icon to a generation of young Islamists. Qutb's vision of a divinely mandated revolution against secular and westernized Muslim regimes spoke directly to al-Zawahiri's emerging convictions. By the age of 15, Ayman al-Zawahiri was no ordinary schoolboy. He had already formed a secret cell with 4 other secondary school students who shared a common dream: the overthrow of the Egyptian secular regime and the creation of an Islamic state modeled after Qutb's interpretation of Sharia law. This was not mere adolescent rebellion. In this underground circle, Qutb's call for a vanguard of committed believers, the elite few destined to restore divine order, took root as a guiding principle for life. For Ayman, this cell was the beginning of his lifelong jihad. It was also the moment he discovered the potent fusion of faith and activism. At a time when many of his peers were dreaming of university, careers, or emigration, Ayman was dreaming of revolution. He began to view the Egyptian state, then led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, as an agent of jahiliyyah, ignorance, a term Qutba used to liken modern regimes to the pre-Islamic era. In this ideological war, the enemy was not only the West but also the Muslim governments that, in his eyes, had betrayed God's law. And so, long before he would pick up a rifle or meet Osama bin Laden, Ayman al Zawahiri had already embraced the worldview that would define the rest of his life. His early religious commitment also led him to embrace austere personal habits. He prayed regularly, abstained from common youthful indulgences, and adopted a serious demeanor. In retrospect, this period appears as the spiritual and intellectual forging of a man who would eventually reject both his family's social class and the entire modern order in favor of a permanent, ideological war against what he saw as the enemies of Islam. The young Ayman al Zawahiri did not spring from the margins of society, but from its pinnacle. His rebellion was not born of poverty or exclusion, but of disillusionment with the secular, westernized trajectory of the Egyptian elite to which he himself belonged. This tension between privilege and protest, between bookish restraint and radical action, would follow him into adulthood as he stepped forward into the world as both healer and warrior, doctor and zealot, on a path that would ultimately lead to the highest ranks of global jihadism. Part 2, From Scalpel to Subversion, Medical Training and Ideological Awakening. Following the rigorous expectations of his elite upbringing, Ayman al Zawahiri followed a conventional path for a gifted young man of his background. He enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine at Cairo University in the early 1970s. The medical field was well respected, particularly in his family where his father and other relatives were esteemed physicians and academics. Yet for Ayman, medicine was never merely a profession. It was a duty that coexisted with an inner, growing sense of political and religious mission. Al-Zawahiri was a disciplined and high-performing student. In 1974, he graduated with a degree in medicine, receiving a grade roughly equivalent to a B in the American system, known as Jayyid Jiddan in Egyptian academic terminology. During his studies, he specialized in surgery, a field that suited his precise mind and attention to detail. After graduation, he served as a surgeon in the Egyptian army from 1974 to 1978, fulfilling the obligatory service required of graduates. During this time, he was assigned to military hospitals and is reported to have performed his duties quietly and competently. But beneath his white coat and professional demeanor, al-Zawahiri's ideological passions were hardening. The intellectual influence of Sayyid Qutb remained strong, and the political climate of Egypt during the presidency of Anwar Sadat only deepened his convictions. Sadat's move to liberalize Egypt's economy, his diplomatic overtures to the West, and most significantly, his historic peace treaty with Israel in 1979, enraged al-Zawahiri and many others in Egypt's Islamist underground. For them, Sadat had become the very embodiment of betrayal, an apostate ruler willing to compromise with enemies of Islam. While still active in the medical profession, Ayman pursued further academic credentials. In 1978, he earned a master's degree in surgery, bolstering his credentials and reputation. That same year, he opened a private clinic in the suburb of Mahdi, not far from his family home. His patients saw a competent and quiet man, professional and reserved. Yet outside the clinic, he was increasingly active in religious and clandestine circles. It was during this period that al-Zawahiri deepened his ties to Egypt's Islamist underground. He became more involved with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, EIJ, a militant offshoot that had developed in opposition to the more popular but less radical Muslim Brotherhood. Whereas the Brotherhood focused on social reform and religious education, the EIJ embraced the idea of violent revolution. The objective was stark and uncompromising: to overthrow the secular Egyptian government and establish an Islamic theocracy. Al-Zawahiri was not a mere foot soldier in this movement. Thanks to his education, discipline, and religious commitment, he quickly rose through the ranks. He formed close relationships with ideologues, recruiters, and clerics who shared his vision. His leadership style was methodical, calculating, and deeply strategic. Though not an orator or charismatic populist like other Islamist figures, his authority stemmed from his intellect and his fierce adherence to doctrine. By his late 20s, al Zawahiri had successfully fused two worlds, his life as a physician and his role as a clandestine operative. He was both healer and plotter. His clinic became a discreet meeting place for fellow jihadists. He used his social standing to mask his activities, shielding the operations of the EIJ from public scrutiny and police suspicion. His proficiency in multiple languages, including Arabic, English, and French, made him a significant figure in the organization's aspirations beyond Egypt. Effective communication enabled him to engage with a broad range of Islamic scholarship and revolutionary thought, as well as to foster relationships with international acquaintances. He explored jihadist writings, political theory, and strategic ideas, integrating them into a personal framework that interpreted violence as a religious duty. During this period, his personal life also began to develop. In 1978, he married Asa Ahmed Nawari, a student of philosophy at Cairo University. The marriage followed traditional and conservative customs, reflecting his deeply held beliefs. Their wedding, held at the historic Continental Hotel in Opera Square, was a simple gathering with no music or outward celebration. Attendees were separated by gender, and no photographs were taken. Even in this private setting, al Zawahiri's strict interpretation of Islam guided the tone and structure of the event. In the years that followed, Asa gave birth to several children, and the family appeared to settle into a quiet routine. However, beneath this appearance of domestic calm, al Zawahiri remained deeply involved in organizing ideological efforts from behind the scenes. His vision was now expanding beyond Egypt's borders. Through his growing network, he began learning more about the emerging global jihadist movement of the 1980s, particularly shaped by the conflict in Afghanistan. It was there, amid the Soviet invasion and the rise of local resistance, that the foundations of al-Qaeda began to form. It was also in Afghanistan that al Zawahiri would meet Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi whose influence and resources would enhance the ideological structure al Zawahiri had spent years refining. By the end of the 1970s, it became evident that al Zawahiri's work in medicine was becoming less central. He was preparing for a different kind of mission, one that involves strategic planning rather than surgery, ideological writings rather than prescriptions, and covert activity rather than clinical care. His transformation from physician to ideological figure was nearly complete. What remained was a broader arena, and he would find it in Afghanistan's mountains. Part 3, Into the Furnace, Afghanistan, Jihad, and the Brotherhood of War. As the 1980s progressed, international focus turned toward a rugged and remote land in Central Asia, Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion in 1979 provoked strong reactions across the Muslim world, and for thinkers like Ayman al Zawahiri, it reinforced long-standing views of perceived threats to Islamic identity. The occupation was seen not just as a military act, but as part of a larger challenge to Muslim societies and their values. This conflict would become a proving ground for a new form of jihad, global in nature, urgent in message, and offered al Zawahiri his first significant international platform. Already influential within Egypt's Islamist movements, al Zawahiri saw both symbolic and practical opportunities in Afghanistan. In 1981, he traveled to Peshawar, Pakistan, a dusty frontier city that had become a kind of open-air headquarters for Islamist volunteers, spies, arms dealers, and foreign journalists. To the world, he arrived as a doctor, a surgeon working with the Red Crescent to treat mujahideen wounded in their struggle against the Soviets. But that was only part of the truth. Underneath the surgeon's coat was a revolutionary with a sharpened worldview, now seeking allies, networks, and influence among the Arab volunteers joining the fight. It was in Peshawar that al Zawahiri became acquainted with Abdullah Azam, a charismatic Palestinian cleric who had co-founded Maktab al-Khadamat, the Services Bureau. This organization coordinated recruitment, funding, and logistics for the thousands of foreign fighters flooding into Afghanistan. Azam had a unifying vision, to bring Muslims together under the banner of jihad against foreign occupation. But al Zawahiri was not impressed by Azam's broad tent. He viewed the struggle not merely as resistance against invaders, but as a vehicle for purifying Islam from within and overthrowing secular regimes across the Muslim world. Azam wanted unity, al Zawahiri demanded ideological purity. Their differing visions would lead to an eventual parting of ways. Yet one relationship formed during this time would become far more consequential than any ideological dispute. In the mid-1980s, accounts suggest 1986 as the most likely year, Ayman al Zawahiri met Osama bin Laden, then a wealthy young Saudi Arabian who had joined the Afghan cause and was quickly gaining influence among Arab fighters. Their meeting, whether in Jeddah or in a Peshawar field hospital, marked the convergence of two of the most dangerous forces in the emerging jihadist movement: bin Laden's resources and personal magnetism, and al-Zawahiri's intellect, ideological fervor, and experience in clandestine operations. The two men were opposites in some ways. Bin Laden was soft-spoken and charismatic, coming from extreme wealth and privilege. Al-Zawahiri was more austere and bookish, often dour and uncompromising. But their shared worldview, centered on the idea that jihad must be global and that apostate Muslim governments must be overthrown, allowed them to forge a close alliance. Over time, al-Zawahiri would become bin Laden's closest confidant and ideological advisor. He was, as some called him, the brains behind al-Qaeda. As the Soviet-Afghan War raged on, al-Zawahiri moved between Pakistan and Afghanistan, treating wounded fighters, recruiting volunteers, and helping to shape what would later become the foundations of a global terrorist network. His role was both practical and ideological. He ensured the flow of Arab recruits from Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, and elsewhere into the Afghan battlefield. He also began shaping their understanding of jihad, not as a nationalist or anti-colonial effort, but as an obligation to reshape the entire Islamic world. In 1985, al-Zawahiri took a brief detour to Saudi Arabia, officially for the Islamic pilgrimage of Hajj, but this journey also allowed him to remain in Jeddah, where he continued to practice medicine and build connections. Some reports suggest he began forming a financial network through Saudi contacts and deepened his ties with bin Laden, who was then living in the kingdom. Whether in hospital corridors or prayer spaces, the two exchanged ideas about a future Islamic vision after Afghanistan. The conflict brought mounting challenges. The Soviets held firm, and casualties rose. Al-Zawahiri witnessed the toll: wounded bodies, lost lives, and mourning families. These scenes did not deter him. Instead, they reaffirmed his beliefs. He saw sacrifice as meaningful and struggle as spiritually necessary. The Soviet withdrawal in 1989 was seen by al-Zawahiri and others as a divine sign. They believed perseverance and faith had overcome a superpower. This outcome left a lasting impression. To him, it confirmed that dedication brought results and divine favor followed conviction. He now aimed to expand his mission, first to Egypt, then more broadly, and eventually to the West. But Egypt posed greater difficulties. Upon returning, al-Zawahiri and his group initiated actions against officials, institutions, and foreign visitors. These attempts, meant to rally support, led instead to firm state reprisals. Many followers were arrested or killed, and the movement weakened. Disillusioned by Egypt's response, al-Zawahiri turned his focus outward. In 1991, after years of setbacks and arrests, he became EIJ's leader. He restructured the group, reinforced its ideology, and sought allies. His attention returned to Afghanistan and familiar networks. Once again, his path aligned with bin Laden. Now more committed and ready to support a new campaign, their partnership signaled a new phase. The Egyptian doctor and Saudi financier now joined forces, not just locally, but in a far-reaching global project. Part 4. The Alliance Forged in Fire, merging with al-Qaeda in the global jihad. By the early 1990s, al-Zawahiri was disheartened by the lack of change in Egypt. Despite years of organizing and targeted operations, the state remained unshaken. The movement he once hoped would inspire masses met resistance and criticism. Many associates were detained or killed. His brother Muhammad was imprisoned and later sentenced in absentia. The vision of an Egyptian Islamic revolution had not come to fruition. It was in this environment, set back at home but still determined, that al Zawahiri turned his focus once more to the broader international jihad. His experiences in Afghanistan remained vivid. Success seemed achievable, but only if Muslims cooperated on a global scale, engaged in persistent resistance, and viewed the conflict as one that extended beyond national boundaries. A revised strategy was required, one that reached beyond Egypt or any particular government. This new approach would be international in scope and firm in conviction. At its core was the belief that both the nearby adversaries, governments seen as un-Islamic, and distant powers, such as the United States and its allies, contributed to the pressures facing the Muslim world and should be addressed collectively. By 1996, al-Zawahiri had formed a closer relationship with Osama bin Laden, who had moved from Sudan to Afghanistan. Both leaders expressed disillusionment with domestic Islamist efforts that had not achieved their aims. Bin Laden, still affluent and becoming more resolute, provided financial backing and visibility. Al-Zawahiri contributed his organizational skills, ideological clarity, and a trusted network of followers. The collaboration between Egyptian Islamic Jihad and al-Qaeda represented more than convenience. It signified the unification of two influential and radical visions. On August 7, 1998, two large truck bombs detonated outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The coordinated explosions caused the deaths of more than 200 people and left thousands injured, many of them civilians. The event drew global attention and signaled al-Qaeda's development into an internationally active militant group. It also marked a significant increase in al-Zawahiri's public profile. No longer limited to activities in Egypt or secluded in the mountains of Afghanistan, he had become one of the most closely monitored individuals in the world. Al-Zawahiri continued to act as al-Qaeda's principal strategist and more visibly as Osama bin Laden's trusted deputy. He was instrumental in organizing the group's structure, composing ideological documents, encouraging foreign supporters, and broadening operations into additional regions. With his guidance, al-Qaeda transformed into a wider network with branches in North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. He fostered connections with aligned groups in Yemen, Somalia, and the Caucasus, broadening al-Qaeda's presence well beyond its original base. His influence also extended into communications and media efforts. In February 1998, this partnership became publicly known when al-Zawahiri joined bin Laden and three other jihadist figures to release a joint statement under the name of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against Jews and Crusaders. The declaration urged Muslims around the world to confront American targets, military and civilian, wherever they were present. Though the statement bore bin Laden's signature, many experts believed al-Zawahiri was its principal author. Its tone was intense, uncompromising, and rooted in religious interpretations used to rationalize violent action. By the end of that year, al-Zawahiri's name had gained global notoriety. Al-Zawahiri recognized that such actions were not solely about force, they were also about symbolism and communication. He frequently appeared in recorded statements beside bin Laden, offering extended critiques of the United States, Israel, and Muslim leaders he viewed as illegitimate. His addresses were dense and doctrinal, rich in religious citations and historical context, aiming to frame al-Qaeda's cause in moral and theological terms while inspiring future adherents. One of al-Zawahiri's most consequential and defining choices involved supporting the planning and execution of the events of September 11th. Though bin Laden is often credited most prominently, intelligence assessments and insider accounts have long indicated that al-Zawahiri played an equally central role in shaping the underlying strategy. He perceived the attacks within the United States as a means to prompt a large-scale American military reaction in the Islamic world, especially Afghanistan, where prolonged conflict might exhaust U.S. resources and galvanize sympathetic support. Following those events, the global focus on al-Qaeda intensified into a sweeping pursuit. The United States launched military operations in Afghanistan, dismantled training facilities, and began a broad search for its leadership. Bin Laden and al-Zawahiri withdrew from public view. Nonetheless, al-Zawahiri remained engaged. He issued video statements, defended earlier actions, criticized Western policies, and called for broad resistance. He also released religious rulings endorsing attacks against civilians, positions that were met with concern, even among ideologically aligned groups. Later in 2001, a computer thought to be al Zawahiri's was recovered after Kabul fell. Among its contents were falsified documents reportedly tied to the killing of Afghan commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, which occurred 2 days before the U.S. attacks. The operation, disguising attackers as journalists, reflected al Zawahiri's deliberate and calculated style. His methods increasingly emphasized planning over spectacle. Over time, as bin Laden retreated deeper into seclusion, al Zawahiri's public and organizational presence grew. He assumed responsibility for preserving group unity amid widespread disruption. He facilitated communication among regional factions and continued to guide the movement's ideological direction. From hidden locations, be it in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or elsewhere, he worked to maintain influence through discourse and legacy. In 2004, bin Laden officially named him as his deputy, confirming a leadership structure that had long been in practice. While bin Laden remained the symbolic figurehead, al Zawahiri emerged as the strategist, connecting networks, shaping doctrine, and envisioning a broad campaign. Yet consequences would soon follow. Part 5, From Second to First, Ascension after bin Laden and the Struggle for Control. On May 2, 2011, the world learned that Osama bin Laden, the individual most associated with al-Qaeda and its global image, had been killed in a U.S. Navy SEAL operation in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The operation, conducted with surgical precision and years of intelligence groundwork, marked a major symbolic victory in the U.S.-led war on terror. But for Ayman al Zawahiri, it also marked a personal turning point. After decades of standing in the shadow of bin Laden, he was now the presumptive leader of al-Qaeda. The announcement of al Zawahiri's succession came on June 16, 2011, through al-Qaeda's media wing. Though the move had been expected, the delay of over a month led analysts to speculate about possible internal friction within the group. Al-Qaeda had always been more decentralized than many assumed, and its various branches, from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, had their own leaderships, priorities, and loyalties. While al Zawahiri was widely acknowledged as the intellectual and ideological engine of the organization, he lacked bin Laden's charisma and populist appeal, particularly among the newer generation of jihadists. Still, his rise was inevitable. He had been there since the beginning. He had merged the Egyptian Islamic Jihad with al-Qaeda. He had helped craft the organization's theological justification for violence. He had endorsed, and likely engineered, some of its most spectacular and deadly attacks. He was bin Laden's senior advisor, closest confidant, and ideological partner. No other contender had both his resume and his seniority. But his new role brought with it new challenges. Al-Qaeda was no longer the formidable monolith it had been in the early 2000s. The death of bin Laden dealt a psychological blow to the movement, and the rise of new, more aggressive jihadist actors, especially the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, threatened to sideline al-Qaeda in the broader jihadist landscape. ISIS was bold, brutal, and highly media-savvy. It declared a caliphate in 2014, capturing large swaths of Iraq and Syria, and drew thousands of recruits from around the globe. Al Zawahiri responded with a mix of condemnation and caution. He denounced ISIS's excessive brutality and its unilateral declaration of a caliphate, calling it illegitimate and dangerous to the unity of the global jihad. At the same time, he attempted to assert al-Qaeda's seniority, reminding militants that al-Qaeda had decades of experience and a more principled approach. In reality, though, the split exposed growing divisions within the global jihadist movement, divisions that al Zawahiri struggled to heal. To counter ISIS's growing influence, al Zawahiri doubled down on cultivating regional franchises that would remain loyal to al-Qaeda's leadership. In North Africa, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, remained aligned. In the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, continued to issue statements in his name. In the Indian subcontinent, al Zawahiri announced the formation of a new branch, al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, AQIS, in 2014 aimed at expanding influence into Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. He also tried to present al-Qaeda as the reasonable jihadist alternative, no less committed to global revolution, but more cautious in its tactics and less prone to the wanton slaughter of Muslims that had come to define ISIS. In recorded statements, al-Zawahiri urged aligned groups to avoid internal conflict and maintain focus on broader objectives. But these appeals were often met with limited response. Many younger militants viewed ISIS as more dynamic, swift, and results-driven. Nevertheless, al-Zawahiri remained consistent. His addresses, though often dense and formal, outlined al-Qaeda's perspective on a prolonged confrontation with Western powers. He emphasized the importance of the Palestinian issue in ideological messaging, criticized foreign interventions in Muslim-majority regions, and referenced incidents such as the Boston Marathon and Charlie Hebdo attacks as symbolic moments. He remained primarily an ideologue, one who favored strategic clarity over operational innovation. While his leadership was accepted within al-Qaeda's core, regional affiliates sometimes questioned his relevance. In Syria, for instance, Jabhat al-Nusra, an affiliate, eventually broke away and adopted a new identity, in part to reflect a shift from earlier associations. Al-Zawahiri's influence faced repeated challenges, and although he retained symbolic stature, his practical authority over operations declined. Behind the scenes, he remained difficult to trace. Analysts believed he was concealed in remote border areas of Pakistan or Afghanistan, assisted by local networks and a shrinking group of trusted supporters. The United States placed a $25 million reward on his capture, matching the previous figure offered for bin Laden. His public appearances were infrequent, and his communications tightly managed. For years, intelligence agencies monitored his network, tracked intermediaries, analyzed communications, and gathered intelligence through human sources. In many respects, al-Zawahiri became increasingly intangible, continuing to lead and advise, yet physically isolated and advancing in age. His organization was changing around him. New figures were rising in regions like Yemen, Somalia, and the Sahel. Technological advances were reshaping the landscape. Digital platforms, secure messaging, and global media transformed methods of outreach and coordination. Al-Zawahiri, trained in secrecy and analog tools, began to appear out of step with newer generations of militants. Still, despite these shifts, he remained a point of influence. His words continued to resonate in some circles, and his strategic role retained significance across parts of the broader movement. He may have lacked charisma or dramatic presence, but his commitment to ideology and long-term vision sustained his role within the network's leadership. As the 2010s came to a close, al-Zawahiri was still releasing statements, still speaking from concealment, still calling for continued resistance. Yet doubts were surfacing. Was he still active? Still leading? Had the movement evolved beyond him? An answer would soon emerge. Part 6. Hiding in the Shadows. Final years of a fugitive leader. After the death of Osama bin Laden and the rise of ISIS, Ayman al Zawahiri remained hidden from view, yet still served as a symbol of al-Qaeda's enduring presence. Though his influence in jihadist circles faced increasing competition from younger, more sensational figures like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, al-Zawahiri never relinquished the helm of al-Qaeda. From his hidden refuge, suspected to be in the rugged Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, he worked to preserve the ideological framework and structural coherence of the network he had helped build over decades. To his followers and rivals alike, al-Zawahiri was something of a paradox. He was revered for his longevity and ideological purity, yet also criticized for his remoteness and inability to adapt to the rapidly shifting landscape of global jihadism. His communications were infrequent and often outdated by the time they surfaced. Many of his videos appeared without visual proof of life, leading analysts to question whether he was alive, ill, or simply too cautious to be seen. Throughout the 2010s, U.S. intelligence agencies continued their relentless pursuit of al-Zawahiri. He remained at the top of the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, with a reward of $25 million for information leading to his capture or death. Despite this, he managed to evade capture for over 2 decades, thanks in part to a network of loyal protectors in South Asia, especially among the Taliban and the Haqqani network. Al-Zawahiri's movements remained incredibly restricted. According to intelligence sources and defectors, he avoided electronic communications, rarely traveled, and relied heavily on couriers to relay messages. He lived in secrecy, isolated even from some of his own followers. His health was frequently questioned. Rumors circulated that he suffered from heart problems and required constant medical attention. In 2020 and early 2021, reports suggested he had died of natural causes, although these turned out to be false. Despite his physical isolation, al-Zawahiri continued to release statements and video messages, occasionally commenting on global events. He responded to U.S. foreign policy decisions, praised terrorist attacks across the Muslim world, and continued to assert al-Qaeda's relevance in the face of ISIS's growing notoriety. In one message, he even praised a young Indian Muslim student who had defied her college's ban on the hijab, an effort to appeal to a new audience and reinvigorate his waning influence in South Asia. But the tone of his messages increasingly reflected a man out of step with the times. His videos lacked the high production values of ISIS propaganda, and his delivery was scholarly, long-winded, and monotonous. Many young jihadists found his content less inspiring, more academic than revolutionary. His references to older grievances, like the U.S. presence in Iraq or the Crusades, seemed disconnected from the immediate crises engulfing Muslim countries in the 2020s, such as the civil wars in Syria, the rise of sectarian militias, or China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims. Even within al-Qaeda, questions emerged about succession. The name most often mentioned as al-Zawahiri's potential replacement was Saif al-Adel, a former Egyptian Special Forces officer and longtime al-Qaeda strategist, believed to be living in Iran. But the organization refused to confirm any new leader, fearing that doing so would not only violate operational secrecy, but also invite more international scrutiny, especially toward the Taliban, who were then returning to power in Afghanistan. As the Taliban seized control of Kabul in August 2021 following the chaotic U.S. withdrawal, al-Qaeda saw a moment of vindication. For al-Zawahiri, it was the realization of a decades-long hope that a Western-backed government would collapse, allowing an Islamist movement to reassert itself. But his moment of triumph was fleeting and ultimately fatal. In early 2022, U.S. intelligence agencies began to pick up signs that al-Zawahiri had emerged from his reclusive hiding. Reports indicated that he had moved into a secure compound in Kabul's Sherpur neighborhood, an upscale district that once housed foreign embassies, but was now under the control of the Taliban. According to intelligence assessments, the building was owned or controlled by a senior member of the Haqqani network, suggesting that al-Zawahiri was being actively protected by elements within the Taliban government. What followed was months of careful surveillance by the CIA and U.S. intelligence community. They tracked al-Zawahiri's routines, confirming his presence through shadow analysis and human intelligence. He reportedly appeared regularly on a balcony, enjoying fresh air, convinced that he was finally safe under the Taliban's rule. But the United States had not forgotten. On the morning of July 31, 2022, just after sunrise, 2 Hellfire missiles, believed to be of the R9X variant, which kills through kinetic blades rather than explosion, struck the balcony where al-Zawahiri was standing. The strike was so precise that reports confirmed no other members of his family or surrounding civilians were harmed. Hours later, the Biden administration confirmed the operation's success. Ayman al Zawahiri was dead. The news reverberated across the world. For nearly 40 years, al-Zawahiri had been a symbol of global jihadism, first as a surgeon turned radical, then as the architect of al-Qaeda's ideology, and finally as its most enduring figurehead. His death was hailed by U.S. officials as a long-awaited act of justice and a demonstration of America's continued ability to reach its enemies, even in the heart of Taliban-ruled Kabul. Yet others noted that his death, while symbolically powerful, came at a time when al-Qaeda had already receded into relative obscurity. Analysts debated whether his killing would meaningfully alter the structure of global jihad or simply mark the end of an era. For many jihadists, al-Zawahiri's leadership had been uninspiring. For many in the West, his death was anticlimactic compared to the killing of bin Laden. Still, for the victims of terrorism and the families of those lost on 9/11, his death offered a final measure of accountability. The doctor who had once taken an oath to heal had spent his life masterminding acts of destruction. Now, at last, his reign had ended. Not in a courtroom, but in the silence of an Afghan morning, under the crosshairs of a drone he never saw coming. Part 7. Legacy of a Doctrinaire, Ideology, Writings, and Global Influence. Ayman al Zawahiri's influence did not rest solely on the violent operations he planned or enabled. It lay equally in his rigorous and dogmatic ideology. Throughout his life, he positioned himself as more than a jihadist commander. He was a theorist of global Islamic revolution, a writer of manifestos, and a self-styled scholar who sought to give intellectual weight and religious justification to al-Qaeda's war against the West, against secular Muslim governments, and even against other Islamist movements that deviated from his narrow path. At the heart of al-Zawahiri's worldview was the belief in takfir, the practice of declaring other Muslims to be unbelievers if they failed to live up to what he defined as the correct Islamic doctrine. This concept was not original to him. It had been advocated by earlier ideologues like Sayyid Qutb, but al-Zawahiri turned it into an operational imperative. He believed that Muslim regimes that cooperated with the West, implemented secular laws, or tolerated pluralism were apostate and must be overthrown. His writings painted a black and white view of the world, divided between true Muslims and their enemies, with no space for compromise, dialogue, or political reform. One of his most important ideological contributions came in the form of his book, Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, 2001, published shortly before the 9/11 attacks. In it, al-Zawahiri provided a strategic and theological roadmap for jihadist warfare. He traced the rise of jihadist movements from Afghanistan to Egypt, praised martyrdom as a divine gift, and argued that the West, particularly the United States, must be targeted in its heartlands to provoke military overreach and radicalize more Muslims. He emphasized that jihad was not merely a localized struggle, but a global obligation that could only end when all Muslim lands were free from Western influence and governed by Sharia. This document became required reading for many aspiring jihadists. It was circulated on jihadist websites, translated into multiple languages, and analyzed extensively by intelligence services worldwide. Its tone was not emotional or bombastic. It was cold, methodical, and deeply rooted in Islamic jurisprudence, albeit a radicalized and selective interpretation. It portrayed terrorism not as desperation, but as strategic warfare carried out in the service of a religious mission. Throughout his career, al-Zawahiri maintained a deep interest in history and religious scholarship. His speeches often referenced Islamic military victories, the Crusades, colonialism, and the supposed betrayals of Muslim rulers. He used this history to legitimize his cause, claiming that he and his followers were merely continuing the struggles of past Islamic heroes. But his scholarship was polemical and exclusionary. He rejected any notion of coexistence with non-Muslims, criticized moderate Islamic movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, and condemned Shia Islam in harsh sectarian terms. Al-Zawahiri's critiques extended beyond Western powers and apostate governments. He also engaged in heated ideological battles with rival jihadist groups, especially the Islamic State, ISIS. While both al-Qaeda and ISIS emerged from similar ideological roots, al-Zawahiri rejected ISIS's unilateral declaration of a caliphate and its excessively violent tactics, such as the public beheadings and massacres of Shia civilians and fellow Sunnis. In multiple audio messages, al-Zawahiri denounced ISIS's brutality and accused it of sowing division within the global jihadist community. These disputes highlighted al-Zawahiri's doctrinal rigidity. While he supported violence against the West and Muslim regimes, he emphasized strategic patience, the careful building of alliances, and gradual societal indoctrination. He believed ISIS's tactics alienated Muslim populations and undermined the long-term goals of jihad. Yet this stance also made him appear less decisive to younger jihadists, who were drawn to the more aggressive and theatrical methods of ISIS leadership. The split became one of the most significant schisms in the history of global jihad. Despite being overtaken by newer movements in terms of media outreach and territorial gains, al-Zawahiri remained the symbolic head of a global jihadist ideology. He was revered by older jihadists as a founding father of modern Islamic militancy, and his writings continued to shape the curricula of training camps and extremist websites. His pronouncements were regularly cited by al-Qaeda affiliates from Yemen to the Sahel, and he remained a theological authority for splinter groups seeking legitimacy. He also maintained a persistent focus on regional jihadist movements. He lent vocal support to armed factions in Syria, Somalia, Kashmir, and Xinjiang. He praised the Uyghur militants of the Turkestan Islamic Party, urging jihad against the Chinese government. He framed global conflicts, from Palestine to Nigeria, as components of a single war between the forces of Islam and the forces of disbelief. In doing so, he sought to unite disparate movements under the al-Qaeda umbrella, even as communication and control over these affiliates grew more tenuous. Al-Zawahiri also took positions on emerging global issues. He condemned Arab leaders who normalized relations with Israel, accused the Iranian regime of betrayal for its cooperation with the United States in Iraq, and criticized Western interventions across Africa and the Middle East. His ideological rigidity was matched by an ability to adapt his narrative to evolving events, keeping al-Qaeda's worldview seemingly relevant despite declining influence on the battlefield. In the end, al-Zawahiri's legacy lies not in the number of attacks he personally planned, but in the worldview he shaped. He took the doctrine of political Islam and weaponized it with surgical precision. He transformed a disillusioned network of exiles and prisoners into a global movement with reach, structure, and ideological coherence. He was not a charismatic leader, nor a battlefield commander, but he was, unquestionably, the architect of a vision that inspired a generation of violence. That vision did not die with him, even if its prominence waned. His sermons and fatwas, his books and speeches, remain archived and accessible to those who continue to embrace al-Qaeda's cause. For some, he was a scholar warrior defending Islam against centuries of oppression. For others, he was a fanatic who betrayed the very faith he claimed to uphold. But no one, ally or enemy, doubted the power of his ideas. Part 8. Family, Relationships, and the Personal World Behind the Radical. Beneath Ayman al Zawahiri's public image as a militant ideologue and international terrorist was a more obscure and rarely examined facet of his life, his role as a son, brother, husband, and father. Often portrayed as a cold and cerebral figure, al-Zawahiri's personal world was nonetheless filled with family ties, personal loss, and relationships that both shaped and complicated his path. Born into a tightly knit and conservative family in Giza, Egypt, Ayman was the eldest of several siblings. His father, Muhammad Rabi al-Zawahiri, was a respected surgeon and professor at Cairo University, while his mother, Umayma Azam, came from one of Egypt's most prestigious and politically connected families. Ayman's maternal grandfather, Abdel Wahab Azam, was an academic, a diplomat, and the first rector of King Saud University in Saudi Arabia. These familial connections granted Ayman status and privilege, yet also imposed a rigid expectation of excellence and piety. Ayman's siblings followed in the family's intellectual tradition. His twin sister Umnya and his younger sister Heba both pursued academic careers. Heba became a professor of medical oncology at Cairo University, and in rare public comments described Ayman as quiet and shy during childhood, someone who preferred studying to sports or games, someone more inward than expressive. His younger brother, Muhammad al Zawahiri, also became entangled in the world of radical Islam, but his trajectory was more chaotic. Muhammad was arrested, imprisoned, and sentenced to death in Egypt for his involvement in militant activities, but was later released in 2011, only to be rearrested and then acquitted in 2017. For Ayman, family ties were tightly bound with ideology. He admired his maternal uncle, Mahfouz Azam, a devout Islamist lawyer who deeply influenced his religious worldview. Mahfouz became a role model to Ayman during his teenage years, shaping his views on politics and faith at a critical age. This influence, coupled with the writings of Sayyid Qutb, helped radicalize him at a time when Egypt was still reeling from political upheaval and the imprisonment of Islamist thinkers. In 1978, al Zawahiri married Azza Ahmed Nawari, a fellow Cairo University student who studied philosophy. Their marriage was conservative and traditional, reflecting his austere approach to religion. The wedding, held at the Continental Hotel in Opera Square, excluded music, photographs, and all forms of light-hearted celebration. Men and women were strictly segregated, and the overall tone was solemn, more akin to a religious ceremony than a joyous union. Despite her background in secular philosophy, Azza lived a deeply private life under her husband's strict moral code. Together, the couple had 6 children. Their first daughter, Fatima, was born in 1981, followed by Umayma in 1983, Nabila in 1986, and Khadija and Muhammad, twins, in 1987. Their final daughter, Aisha, born in 1997, was diagnosed with Down syndrome. Al-Zawahiri was reportedly affectionate toward his children, especially the younger ones, though he remained stern and ideologically unwavering. His son Muhammad was described by family acquaintances as gentle and polite, a child who preferred helping his mother at home to playing outside with boys, perhaps a tender reflection of the more human side of his father's life. Tragedy would soon shatter the family. In late December 2001, during the early stages of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, an American airstrike targeted a Taliban-controlled guest house in Gardes, where al-Zawahiri's wife and children were hiding. Azza was buried under rubble and refused to be rescued by male strangers due to her adherence to Islamic modesty. She died the following day. Her son Muhammad was killed outright in the strike, and their 4-year-old daughter Aisha, though initially unharmed, died overnight from exposure to the cold. The loss of his wife and 2 children was never publicly addressed by al-Zawahiri in any depth, but those close to him later suggested it had a profound emotional effect. According to some sources, he became more rigid and fatalistic after the tragedy, retreating deeper into his ideology. Yet even amid grief, he never renounced his path. Instead, he viewed the deaths as martyrdoms, part of the broader sacrifice in the war he had chosen. After Azza's death, al-Zawahiri remained married to at least 3 other wives. One of them, Umayma Hassan, stepped into a more public role than her predecessor. In 2012, she released a statement online praising the role of Muslim women in the Arab Spring, particularly those who had participated in protests or supported their husbands in jihad. She also authored a pamphlet encouraging women to uphold the values of jihad within the home, presenting an image of women not as fighters, but as moral and logistical supporters of male warriors. Umayma's messages were part of a broader effort by al-Qaeda to expand its appeal to Muslim women, albeit within the narrow confines of militant patriarchy. In the mid-2000s, al-Zawahiri also fathered a daughter named Nawar with one of his surviving wives. Not much is known about Nawar or his remaining children, who presumably lived with him or nearby during his years in hiding. Al-Zawahiri never encouraged women to fight in combat, reiterating on several occasions that women's primary duty was to raise children and care for mujahideen fighters. His views on gender were deeply traditional, rejecting any notion of female autonomy in public or military spheres. Despite the secrecy surrounding his whereabouts and personal life, it was clear that family mattered deeply to al-Zawahiri, even as he exposed them to extraordinary danger through his militant activities. His personal losses and strict patriarchal beliefs reflected the contradictions at the heart of his life. A man who spoke of divine mercy but showed little compassion for others, a husband and father who sacrificed his family for the pursuit of a brutal vision of God's law. Over the years, members of his extended family were subjected to government surveillance, imprisonment, and exile. Some publicly disavowed terrorism, others remained silent. But the Zawahiri name became synonymous with jihad, extremism, and a legacy of violence that no personal affection or familial bond could overcome. Al-Zawahiri's private world, though often hidden behind a veil of secrecy, offered a glimpse into the human dimension of a man who helped mastermind one of the most devastating terror campaigns of the modern era. It revealed the heavy cost of his choices, not only for his enemies, but for those who shared his name and his blood. Part 9. Judgment and Aftermath. The Global Legacy of Ayman al Zawahiri. The assassination of Ayman al Zawahiri on July 31st, 2022, by a CIA drone strike in Kabul, Afghanistan, brought to an end one of the longest manhunts in modern history. But the death of the Egyptian-born militant physician did not erase the impact he had carved across continents and decades. His passing, more than 20 years after the September 11th attacks, marked the closure of a dark and formative era in global security and counterterrorism. Yet in the shadows of that event lay a legacy far more enduring than the man himself, an ideological framework that continues to ripple through time, influencing a new generation of extremists and confounding efforts at global peace. In official circles, the reaction to his death was swift. U.S. President Joe Biden, in a televised address, confirmed the successful strike and declared that justice had been delivered. The operation, carried out by a drone, while al-Zawahiri stood on the balcony of a safe house in the Taliban-controlled Sherpur district of Kabul, had been meticulously planned over weeks. Intelligence operatives had tracked his movements, identified his routine, and confirmed his presence with near certainty. The use of R-9 Hellfire missiles, nicknamed ninja bombs for their non-explosive, kinetic precision, was designed to minimize collateral damage. There were no civilian casualties. The symbolic importance of al-Zawahiri's killing cannot be overstated. He was the last surviving figure from the group of core leaders who had plotted the September 11th attacks, and his death signaled the final blow to that generation of al-Qaeda leadership. It also highlighted the uncomfortable truth that even under a new Taliban regime in Kabul, al-Qaeda leadership had found sanctuary once again, reviving fears of Afghanistan becoming a breeding ground for terrorism as it had been before 2001. But beyond the headlines and official statements, his death raised difficult and unresolved questions. What had al-Zawahiri truly achieved? Had his ideological revolution succeeded or failed? What did he leave behind, and who would take up his mantle? In some ways, his life's work could be considered a strategic failure. He had envisioned the toppling of secular Muslim regimes, the expulsion of Western influence from Islamic lands, and the eventual establishment of a unified Islamic caliphate under al-Qaeda's leadership. Yet none of these goals were realized during his lifetime. Egypt remained under military-backed rule. Western military power, while reduced, still operated in parts of the Middle East and Africa. And far from being united, the jihadist movement had fractured into rival factions, most notably the Islamic State, ISIS, whose brutality and ambition had eclipsed al-Qaeda in the minds of many younger militants. Even within jihadist circles, al-Zawahiri had become a controversial and often underwhelming figure. While Osama bin Laden had inspired reverence, al-Zawahiri was frequently seen as overly intellectual, distant, and uncharismatic. His long-winded videos, filled with theological analysis and historical lectures, lacked the bombast and emotional pull that newer jihadist figures utilize so effectively in the age of viral propaganda and social media. Many younger militants simply stopped listening to him. And yet, to reduce his influence to operational shortcomings or stylistic contrast with ISIS would be a grave miscalculation. Al-Zawahiri's true legacy lies not in the number of attacks he authorized, but in the ideological scaffolding he helped build, a blueprint for global jihad that outlived his own relevance. He was the architect of a worldview that divided the globe into a binary conflict between Islam and everything else. He defined jihad as a universal obligation, not limited to national borders or defensive wars. He codified the practice of targeting civilians, of labeling Muslim governments as apostate, of fusing Salafi theology with militant activism. His writings, speeches, and manifestos continue to circulate in online forums, madrasas, and encrypted chat groups. His ideas remain alive in insurgencies from Mali to the Philippines. After his death, al-Qaeda declined to name a formal successor, though Saif al-Adel, a veteran strategist believed to be residing in Iran, was widely presumed to have taken the reins quietly. The group had learned from the decapitation of its leadership that publicity could bring swift annihilation. But the reluctance to name a new emir also revealed something deeper, that al-Qaeda's core command had lost much of its operational relevance, and that its role was now largely symbolic, a flag around which others might rally, but not necessarily take orders. Outside the jihadist world, al-Zawahiri's life was dissected by scholars, journalists, and intelligence analysts seeking to understand what had turned a gifted young surgeon into the mastermind of global terror. Some emphasize the role of Egypt's brutal prisons, where young Islamists were tortured and radicalized during the 1980s. Others trace the influence of ideologues like Sayyid Qutb, whose writings turned political frustration into holy war. Still others pointed to the failures of modern Arab governance, the scars of colonialism, and the alienation of young Muslims in the diaspora. But whatever the root causes, al-Zawahiri made a choice. He chose violence, not dialogue. He chose ideology over empathy, absolutism over reform. He sacrificed his family, his homeland, and his medical profession in pursuit of a vision that brought pain to millions. He was responsible for sowing fear from Manhattan to Mombasa, from Bali to Baghdad. And though his body was vaporized in silence above the streets of Kabul, his ghost continues to haunt the policies of nations and the conscience of those drawn to his doctrine. In the end, Ayman al Zawahiri was not just a terrorist. He was a thinker of terror. He wielded scripture like a weapon, turning sacred texts into tools of war. His war outlasted the Cold War, survived the Arab Spring, and adapted to the digital age. He died not as a martyr in a glorious battlefield, but as an old man peering over a balcony, fragile, tracked, and out of time. Yet his legacy, poisoned as it was, is not easily buried. The fight against the ideology he helped construct remains one of the 21st century's greatest moral and strategic challenges. The death of al-Zawahiri was a blow, but the war of ideas he helped ignite lives on,